I started my first company, Tusk Strategies, in 2010. It's a political consulting firm that runs big legislative and policy campaigns all over the US. And I was sitting in a meeting in early 2011, and a friend of mine called and said, "Hey, there's a guy with a small transportation startup. He's having some regulatory problems. Would you mind talking to him?" I become Uber's first political advisor that day. And then when Travis Kalanick called me back, Travis was the founder and CEO. He
Hmm.
said, "Listen, I can't afford your fee. Would you take equity?" I didn't know what equity meant, but for some reason I just heard myself saying yes.
Hmm.
And that meant I started getting stock in Uber very, very early on. But more important, it meant that it became my job to legalize Uber in New York and then markets all over the US.
Bradley Tusk, thanks for coming on and talking to us today.
Yeah, hey, Brian, thanks for having me.
So, we're going to talk about your career. And as a lot of people know, the whole point of your career is this sort of like intersection between tech and politics and
Yeah.
governance. But if I made you say, what is your true love? Is it politics or is it technology?
Oh, it's definitely politics for sure.
That came
I'm
that came first, right?
Yeah, and I think I'm kind of much more of a political junkie than a tech junkie for sure. But the funny thing I've noticed though is that people who work in politics now see me as like a tech and business guy, and
Mm.
people who work in tech see me as a political guy. So whatever you are, you assume I'm the opposite.
Or we assume that you're on our team, I guess, is the way.
Or maybe not actually.
Well, that's true, I suppose. But you went to school, Penn, Chicago law. What did you think your career was going to be?
Paul, well, so when I was in college, I was actually in the creative writing program. But
Mm.
at the same time, I had worked for the mayor of Philadelphia, Ed Rendell, all through college. And so I kind of hit that point towards the end where I'm like, okay, I could probably pursue a career in either of these. And I really liked both a lot. And my thought process was, I was a pretty good writer, but like my ceiling would have been like a showrunner on a sitcom. I probably would have done just fine doing that, but that was my ceiling. I wasn't going to win the Pulitzer Prize. I wasn't going to win the National Book Award. Whereas with politics, I felt like who knows what I could do. And so I pursued that instead. And I got incredibly lucky that the things I did in politics were interesting enough that I ended up able to write a couple of books anyway. But definitely politics.
What brought you to New York City?
Well, I grew up in Brooklyn on Long Island,
Hmm.
and then came back after college, came back again after law school, and other than 4 very crazy years back in Chicago as the deputy governor of Illinois, I've really been in New York the whole time. And when you talk about sort of true loves, what I really love is New York City politics even more than state or federal.
You got your start at the Parks Department here, right?
I did. I did.
Under the legendary Henry Stern.
StarQuest. Yep.
Yeah. So that first job, was that like a real education in terms of how like municipal politics works?
It was how municipal government works, I would
Mm.
say. So, in the sense that Henry was appointed, he had been an elected official, a city council member earlier in his career. I got an incredible education from Henry as to how city government works, how the levers of power work, how to get things done, even kind of around the system as opposed to sort of working through the bureaucracy. What was incredible about Henry that was both wildly irresponsible and yet wildly effective was he just hired all these young people from these really good schools, paid us 22 grand a year, and said, okay, go run whatever at the Parks Department. And the good news is he got really talented people, for very little money working 80 hours a week. He definitely violated all kinds of civil service rules along the way, and the city ended up paying a big fine because of it. But I got a great education in kind of what makes people tick. And the thing that I really realized was I was Henry's spokesperson is Henry was like most politicians, which is he desperately, desperately needed as much affirmation and validation as he could possibly get.
Mhm.
And seeing his face on TV, reading his name in the newspapers, what provided it. And so, because I was his press guy and I was pretty good at it, it gave me a sense of like, one, okay, here's the kind of power and influence that I could have with this skill set. But two, here's what make these guys tick.
Is there what years was that
So
at the Parks and Rec?
Parks was two stints. It was sort of 95 to late 96, and then again like 98, 99 or something like that.
Late '90s. So this
Yeah.
is sort of when was there like a sense of energy coming back to the city? One of the reasons we're talking is the 30th anniversary of what
Yeah.
is known as Silicon Alley. Just give me a sense of what the city was like at that time, and maybe around
Yeah,
things like
I'll give two different ways to
yeah.
answer that question. So the first is, yeah, look, I was, early 20s, so I think I probably had, I would have had a ton of energy in any scenario. But you combine that with New York, where we had a job where the commissioner worked 24/7 literally, and there's stuff that happens in the parks 24/7, right? And so like I was working probably a solid 80 hours a week, but also I was young and in New York City, and I was going out every night till
Hmm.
3 in the morning
Hmm.
and sleeping very very little. And I just I was at the age where I had the energy to burn the candle on both ends. And then from a city governance standpoint, Rudy, while he ultimately sort of lost his mind, he did some really innovative things in government. And so, being part of some of those things and that experimentation was really exciting, and it felt really meaningful. And then right around the same time, you had the kind of emergence of the dot-com era in New York City. I think my first exposure to it, I don't know if you remember this, was Cosmo.com.
Hmm. Yep.
And it was like they would deliver you anything,
Hmm.
and it was effectively like free. Like you didn't have to pay. You couldn't tip them. It would cost like half of what it normally
It
would
could be a stick
cost.
of gum, and there's no delivery fee. Yeah.
Yeah, and I remember being like, "This is amazing. How does this work as a business?" And of course, the answer was it didn't.
Hmm.
The guy named Matt Higgins, who's since become a successful tech guy and a judge on Shark Tank, but was in Rudy's press office, went to Cosmo. He was the first person I knew that went into the startup world, and he's done really well.
I just spoke to Josh Harris of pseudo.com fame.
Uh-huh.
And so we were talking a lot about, like, again, the money coming in, the parties downtown, the art scene, but also like the tech scene. And like, was
Yeah.
there a sense at the time that New York City was becoming a tech hub? Well, I don't know that we even had a sense of tech hubs at that point, but do you
Yeah.
remember the tech
I
energy
mean,
coming to the
you
city?
could tell that there was something happening. And to me, where the two really coalesced was fast forward a few years when Mike Bloomberg became mayor, because then all of a sudden you had the organic tech scene and industry developing in New York City, along with a mayor who came from tech, is a trained engineer, and identified, hey, one of the things I want to try to get done in my time here is to diversify the city's economy. And to him, it was very clear that that other sector should be the tech sector. And so he started actively really pursuing it and saying, okay, I want to make this a thing. So then you had the marriage of something happening already because the market allowed for it. And then the government, with all of its resources, saying, we love this, we want to really grow it. And that's when I think all the fuel was added to the fire.
I'm going to jump around just a little bit, but
Yeah,
let's move on to working with Senator Schumer, who
sure.
is literally a couple blocks away from me right now.
Yeah,
But the what did you learn by moving on to Washington in terms of things like I don't know, messaging and
yeah.
like management of policy and stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, really, what I learned in working for Chuck, and look, it was an incredible learning experience. Um, it was a 2 year PhD, effectively, in how media works, how politicians work, how they think, what motivates them. And Chuck was sort of Henry Stern times a million. And Chuck was easily at the time the most sort of media friendly and hungry member of Congress. My guess is at this point now, maybe some people have surpassed him, but. So we just did vast amounts of press for Chuck every single day, of course, culminating every week with his famous Sunday press conference. I think in the 104 Sundays that I worked for him, I got one off for my wedding and one for my honeymoon, and I did press conferences the other 102. And, you know, what I realized was one, if you could come up with clever ideas, people would cover it, talk about it. The press sort of had its need to sort of deliver somewhat entertaining content that seemed important. And at the same time, with Chuck, if I could come up with ideas that would get him attention, that became the legislative agenda. Because the thing that he cared about the most was getting on TV, getting his name in the newspaper. And because I became the person who could like think of stuff that the press would then want to talk about and cover, effectively, if every Sunday plus the rest of the week you have to announce something, that effectively becomes your agenda. At the same time, I don't think we passed a single bill in the 2 years that I was there. It almost felt besides the point. The point was this kabuki theater of which, we worked incredibly hard at it and it felt important. But in reality, if not for 9/11, I don't know that a single thing that I did in the 24 months I was there had any real world impact whatsoever. But 9/11 did happen about almost exactly halfway into my tenure there. And that became a point where, one, uh, the people just really needed to see their leaders and elected officials out and about and on the case as much as possible. I wonder if in today's world that would be the same, but it was the case then. And two, I remember we were trying to get $20 billion in funding for New York, which is it's almost cute now because it's like the
Mm,
amount you get after there's like a fire and then
mm.
for reimbursement. But at the time, it was sort of the biggest, amount that had been given. So getting all of that and some of the subsequent 9/11 related legislation through Congress was really a big deal.
Uh, I'm kind of alighting over this, but Deputy Governor of Illinois, are you learning things about legislation and budget and
Yes.
stuff like that? So,
Yeah, for sure, because I'm running all of it. So,
right.
I'm 29 years old. I'm sitting, at this point, I'm working at City Hall for Mike Bloomberg. We all sit in a bullpen with Mike in the middle, and I'm sitting in the bullpen, and my phone rings, and it's a guy I knew from Washington, and he said, "Hey, do you want to be the deputy governor of Illinois?" And I said, "What's a deputy governor, and why are you calling me?" And the answer was, "It's the person that runs the state." And insanely enough, I got this job where, and by the way, there's just one deputy governor. It's like in New York City, there's like 7 deputy
Hmm.
mayors at any given time. So I was in charge of the state's budget, operations, legislation, policy, and communications. And that meant every dollar, every employee, every policy, every program, everything. And of course, a logical person might be wondering, why would you give a 29-year-old from New York that much responsibility, especially in a place where he really didn't even know? And I think it was a mix of a few things. I think the governor was a guy named Rod Blagojevich, who certainly made himself famous later. And he was so crazy that they understood that they needed someone really young who would view this as a career making opportunity, and would put up with any of his sort of nonsense, to be able to have that job. And I did. But I got there, and I remember my first day being told, okay, there's a $4.8 billion budget deficit, figure out what to do about it. And working with the budget director, a lot of people around the clock, Rod gave us some broad dictates, which was, I don't want to raise taxes. I don't want to cut funding for schools or healthcare or public safety, but make the budget deficit go away. And that certainly meant we had to be pretty creative. But really, I spent a good chunk of my time over the next 4 years figuring out what the budget should be, how to pass it, how to legislate it, negotiating it with the speaker and the Senate majority leader. And the same thing with the policy agenda. And Rod was a very, let's call it, absentee governor. Rod had this view of politics that was both completely insane and yet also wildly logical, which was the job of running for office and the job of holding office were two totally different jobs. And his job was running for office. And he genuinely believed that by winning, he did his job. He's like, I'll see you again in 4 years. And that meant he had virtually no role whatsoever in the actual governance. So, for the state of the state, which would be the speech he would give that would lay out all of our legislative priorities for the session, I'd write the speech. We'd figure out what we wanted to do. I'd write the speech. I'd hand it to him and say, hey, you're going to deliver this off the teleprompter to the legislature on Tuesday. And he would do so brilliantly, by the way, and wildly talented guy. And then he'd go back to Chicago and watch Cubs games and exercise and do all the stuff that he liked to do. And it was my job to try to pass all of these bills and run the state. So, yeah, it was an incredible learning experience. It was not easy because Rod was not an easy person. And luckily, I never really got caught up in his corruption stuff, but he did once slip up and ask me to do something illegal. And fortunately, I knew not to do it and reported it, so I didn't get in any trouble. But as a result, I did have to testify against him at his trial.
Well, coming right off of that, this is probably the wrong way to phrase it, but was that the job that taught you how the sausage was made in terms of legislation and
Yeah,
government?
for sure. Because I think in the Senate, it was so performative
Mm.
that it just there wasn't that much sausage made, and to the extent that it was, Chuck at that point was a very junior senator and wasn't really part of it. Now, of course, he is the sausage maker. And in the Bloomberg world, the stuff that I did definitely gave me some sense of it. So, like, I ran the city's charter revision commission, and I had to both
Hmm.
get the process done and then run the campaign that won to change the city charter. So I learned parts there. But yeah, I learned more in Illinois about how politics work and really about how people work than anything I've ever done.
So I told you we're going to jump around. I will
Yeah,
come back to going into finance, but
sure.
let's jump to the Bloomberg 2009 campaign
Yeah.
because I think that'll get us into Tusk strategies.
Yeah, and
But
by the way, the Lehman blip was pretty uninteresting, so
okay,
feel free to skip it if you want. Like,
well,
I
okay.
don't think in my memoir I even covered it.
Oh, okay. Well, I was just curious if that was seeing the other side of the table. But let's go past it and let's go straight
Yeah,
to the Bloomberg campaign. And again, I want you to frame it for me in the sense of the city, and this is, the teeth of the great financial
yeah,
crisis, but also, and for the purposes of this podcast, tech didn't really. Tech came through it winningly, and tech is about to enter its glory years. So,
yeah.
give me a sense of what that was like the Bloomberg in 2009 New York City.
Yeah. So, I was after Illinois, I had this idea about privatizing state lotteries and took a job on Wall Street to try to do that. And in my great wisdom, picked Lehman Brothers. And Lehman Brothers, as everyone knows, both crashed and burned and took down the
Hmm.
global economy with it. And the day that that happened, I get a call from Mike saying, "I need to see you." And I remember he saying, "Well, what are you doing now?" And I said, "Nothing." And he goes, "Yeah, I know." And he goes, "Well, I feel like I need to run for a third term because the city is now in the middle of this massive fiscal crisis and economic crisis. And so I need to do it, but I need the council to allow me to run for a third term. So you're now the person in charge of passing a law to change that." So that became sort of my immediate job. It was a hard process, but we won. Very controversial. Definitely made our margin a lot smaller in a subsequent election, but we did. And then I ran his mayoral campaign. And, it was obviously a difficult time in the country in a way, but it was also a really exciting time in the country, too, because, like you said, the tech sector, it was taking off in New York City. Even if it took a couple of years for the economy to feel it, you could see the seeds of it happening. Obama took office, and there was a lot of excitement around that. And what's interesting was there, because it was the Mike Bloomberg campaign, which meant he's a tech guy. If you asked him the question, politics or tech, he would say tech, right? Um, he's a tech guy through or through, and we also just had unlimited resources. I remember like experimenting with like this thing called Twitter that just came out, or
Mm-hmm.
like making a Wikipedia page for him, or like all these things that obviously now are very very old school, but at the time they were really at the edges of what was happening. And he loved all of that and encouraged it as much for New York City as possible. And then I think in a way, you had this sort of second tech boom come out, not long after the Great Recession, and Uber and Airbnb and lots of companies. And I think one of the reasons that New York, if you like those things, New York had them because Mike Bloomberg saw the potential of all of those and said, "Hey, I know the taxi system sucks. Here's a better way to do it. Hey, I know the hotel system sucks. Here's a better way to do it." If you were a Bill de Blasio type, your neighbor, then you probably would say that those things were all regretful decisions. But it one of the things when you look at Mike Bloomberg choosing to run for a third term, changing the law and everything else, I don't think that the tech sector in New York City is half as strong as it is today if he didn't have those 4 more years to really tend to it and grow it and prioritize it.
So Tusk Strategies, forgive me for if you don't like how I
Yeah,
describe it,
whatever.
but you're using campaign tactics like you learn in politics for
Yeah,
corporate and startup strategy and regulatory issues and
yeah,
things like that. Now,
yeah,
I've been in the tech industry 25 years. It took a long time, in my opinion, for tech to realize that things like, regulatory or even like dealing with politicians and dealing with PR was something that was important.
yeah.
So, how did you even validate that such a market existed?
Yeah, I mean, just I honestly, I'd love to say that I was a genius and I saw it and I made it happen. The reality is, I fell into it. I was sitting, so I started my first company, Tusk Strategies, in 2010. It's a political consulting firm that runs big legislative and policy campaigns all over the US. And I was sitting in a meeting in early 2011, and a friend of mine called and said, "Hey, there's a guy with a small transportation startup. He's having some regulatory problems. Would you mind talking to him?" I become Uber's first political advisor that day. And then when Travis Kalanick called me back, Travis was the founder and CEO. He
Mm-hmm.
said, "Listen, I can't afford your fee. Would you take equity?" I didn't know what equity meant, but for some reason, I just heard myself saying yes.
Mm-hmm.
And that meant I started getting stock in Uber very, very early on. But more important, it meant that it became my job to legalize Uber in New York and then markets all over the US. And, in many ways, it was just an incredible education because I think even now, when people think about the sort of archetypical tech regulatory fight and campaign, I still think they think of Uber. And in
Sure.
many ways, it was David and Goliath. And we were David at the time, right? So the taxi, and now Uber is this $200 billion company. But at the time, the taxi industry was incredibly politically powerful, incredibly wealthy. They didn't want competition. And we couldn't compete with them in terms of lobbying or campaigns or anything like that. And, we tried something that was really unusual, and thank God it worked, which was, and this is Travis is doing. He just said, "I think our product is so much better than what taxi offers that if we ask our customers to fight for us, they will." And I'm not sure he even knew what to do with it, but he had that thesis and he was right. And so I remember the first time I actually was in DC, the city council had legislation that would have basically banned Uber. And we, at that point, we had a list of our customers, and we didn't even have like anything in the app yet. We just literally sent them an email saying, "Hey, here's what's happening. And if this bill passes, you won't be able to use Uber anymore. So if you like it, would you please reach out to your council member?" And then we just listed like all of their names and numbers. Like hopefully people would know which one was theirs. And 50,000 people reached out like in a week. And the council was so, usually a city council member, if they get like 9 calls about something, that's a lot, right? And then all of a sudden they're getting like thousands. It's like, holy shit. So not only did we beat the bad bill, we wrote our own bill and passed it unanimously. Even the sponsor of the bad bill ended up voting for our bill. And what that taught us was, wow, there's a lot of power in this thing. And then from there, we started sort of, making it better and building the functionality directly into the app to allow our customers to reach out to government. And in pretty much every market in the US, it was the same playbook, which was taxi would come after us with the things that they knew how to do, is kind of the inside game, and all the people that they give donations to, telling us we had to shut down, and then us going to the people. And what it really showed me, and this was the basis for the mobile voting project afterwards, is if every policy output is the result of a political input, if every politician makes every decision solely based on the next election, which is pretty much always true, Mike might have been different, but by and large, that's true. Um, then you just have to shape the equation differently, right? So the equation before, what we did was, you're a council member in Denver or New York or Seattle or wherever. The taxi guys give you a couple of grand per campaign cycle. You do what they want. Now, I just had 6,000 of your constituents who normally don't pay any attention to you whatsoever tell you, "Hey, I like this thing. Don't mess with it." And all of a sudden, you're just doing a cost benefit analysis, and not pissing off 6,000 of your constituents is a lot more important than the couple $1,000 contribution you got from the taxi industry. And the politicians flip. They will just do whatever they need to do to stay in office. That's it. And so we sort of learned that. And in many ways, I think the playbook that we did became sort of the standard playbook for the tech regulatory fights over the next decade.
One of the reasons that Uber is sort of the textbook definition of what you're describing is that the business model can't work if you can't fix the regulatory environment, right?
Correct.
So this will lead us into you being an investor now. What do you say to, if you're looking at a startup or you're advising a company and it's like, this is existential. If we don't solve this part of it, the business isn't going to work. Like, how do you tell founders and companies to think about that?
Well, it's a few things. So one is, I only invest in companies where I believe that if I do my job well, or at this point that the team does it well, it will really move the needle for the company itself. So we ask ourselves, is there a gating regulatory issue or opportunity that if it were solved can really drive growth and valuation? And when the answer is yes, that's when we decide, okay, it makes sense for us to be involved. So I could see a great company, but there's really no regulatory component to it, and we don't invest because I can't help them. I don't do anything. Whereas if you need, a piece of legislation or regulation to survive, to get a license, to be permitted, to just be in existence, then as you said, it's existential. And so one of the things that I look for in founders is, do they understand that, right? Because sometimes they don't. You explain it to them and they get it, but oftentimes it's so foreign to them that they don't kind of accept that. And
Mm.
my view often is, I'm not going to tell you how to do the engineering or coding. I'm not even going to tell you how to do your marketing. But, if you need a political fight done to stay in business and stay alive, you need to truly believe that that is existential, and you need to let me do my job. And so sometimes, less now than the old days, but you would talk to a founder and they would say to you, no, 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 you don't understand. I went to Stanford.
Mm.
I was in Y Combinator. I
Mm.
raised all this money. When those stupid regulators see how smart I am, they're going to do
Mm.
whatever I want. And typically for me, that was, okay, nice talking to you. I'm out. Because the language of politics and the language of tech are two very different languages. And to get elected officials or regulators to do what you want them to do, you have to be able to speak in terms that make sense to them and shift the incentives in a way
Is
that makes sense to
is
them.
that sort of like a tell that they don't have the stomach for this is gonna be long and
Yeah.
complicated as opposed to just engineering something like?
Yeah, I mean, some of them don't have the stomach. I mean, I would say one of the values of the whole Uber fight is it was so high profile that it started to make people aware of, okay, if you're going to create a startup in a regulated industry, there's stuff you have to deal with. No one has a stomach like Travis Kalanick. I mean,
Mm.
he is the toughest person I know, and so I don't even use him as a comparison because it's pointless, right? He's got like some weird gene that's sort of different. Um, but yeah, I mean, oftentimes one of the things that I'll have to figure out before we decide whether to invest or to work on something is, in the original meeting when I'm laying out, here's the plan, everyone's a tough guy. And I'm like, all right, we got to take off their head doing A, B, C, and
Mm.
D. Everyone's in, right? And then oftentimes when it becomes reality, all of a sudden, no, 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 our lawyers are worried about it. It's not nice. It might not look good. And, sometimes if the only way to survive is to run a really brutal campaign and the alternative is death, you run the brutal campaign. And so part of what I am trying to figure out as I'm doing all of this is, do they have the stomach for it? Because it's sort of nothing worse for us than learning that halfway in, especially if we've already invested millions of dollars in the company.
Okay, forgive me. I'm going to Tusk Venture Partners.
Yep.
Now you're an investor.
Yep.
You've invested in things like FanDuel, Lemonade, sports betting, insurance, obviously, telehealth things that
Yeah.
are in a regulatory environment.
Sure.
You wrote a book, The Fixer,
Mm-hmm.
which I would recommend. But also, I love the what is it? The Gotham book. I was looking at
Yeah.
the book prize.
Yep.
I looked at all of the titles earlier today that I was like, oh God, I need that book. I need that book.
There's some really good ones in there. Have you read any of them?
Oh yeah, some of them I had. And what's that new one that just came out from the Bronx is Burning guy? I hope.
Yeah, Ian Fraser.
Not him, no. But anyway,
Jonathan Mahler. Right?
Mahler.
Paradise Bronx by Ian Fraser won the prize this year.
This year, okay,
Right.
all right.
So
That was one of the
and
ones I wanted to see. Yeah.
And then Jonathan, I'm having my podcast in a few weeks. We're doing an event together at my bookstore, P&T Knitwear, on like election week. And it's not, there's a whole jury, but if I had to guess, it will be a nominee for the Gotham Book Prize.
Yes. Okay. This was all me trying to make some room for contemporary questions.
Yeah.
So let's do crypto first.
Sure.
It is obviously obvious and amazing that
Oh,
the
one thing, I can go
Yes.
past 5 also. So if you need time, that's fine.
Okay. Then we'll do that. We'll
Okay.
adjust as needed here. Again, 25 years in tech, I have never seen an industry sort of meet the moment and or shape the moment as crypto has done
Yeah.
over the last 3 years, from basically being, we won't even take meetings with you till to, I don't know, I don't want to say anything that'll get me in trouble politically, but let's say guiding legislation and things
Yeah.
like that. What would you say to me about what crypto has done that maybe it took a long time for tech to learn?
Yeah. A few things. One is it helps to think, for me at least, when I think about kind of the regulation and politics of crypto, the original origins of crypto itself, because really what it's about is a rejection of the system, right? Crypto, this is so getting Satoshi Nakamoto, which is a pseudonym, no one knows who it is, wrote a white paper in 2008 that kind of created the idea for Bitcoin, and that was the birth of the industry. But his entire point was you can't trust central banks, you can't trust central governments. The game is totally rigged, and if we don't want it to be rigged, we as a crypto community, which didn't mean anything at the time, but was incredibly prescient because it happened, um, we are better off throwing our lot in with each other, creating our own type of digital currency with a very clear way through mining and staking as to how it's formed. And even though we don't know each other's names, which is our screen names or whatever else, I still trust you more than I trust the my U.S. senator, my president, the head of the Fed Reserve, whatever it is. And so part of it is, while I was the vast majority of people who trade crypto are not anti-systemic, they just see it as an asset that they can trade. I think that it was born in a very almost revolutionary way. And I think that that gave it a feel and a spirit that's very different than most industries. And I think oftentimes when people try to explain or think about the politics and regulation of crypto, they kind of miss that point, right? And arguably, to me, you could say that the birth of crypto wasn't even 2008, it was the Vietnam War. That was the
Mm.
moment when trust in institutions in the US started to fall and they've never recovered. Government, Wall Street, media, church, higher ed.
And right before Bretton Woods or around the same
Right.
time. Yeah.
All of that, right, exactly. And so I think in some ways that set the stage. So my guess is a little before my time, but you had this medium of television. You had a war that was the first war that we ever were like losing. You had the government both drafting tremendous amounts of young men and sending them overseas, and then lying to the American public, both parties, by the way, consistently, and then getting caught, right? And all of that, which then fed into Watergate, developed this deep distrust that has never really been regained in full sense. And I think crypto is a manifestation of that. And so one is I think it's important to understand that. Two, what crypto did really well is there are some industries. So this was true for Uber. I have found this to be true for sports betting. I found this to be true for weed. So there are some sectors where your customers really like and care about the thing that you do, and they're willing to fight for you, right? So we learned that with Uber, obviously, but I've also learned that the hard way with other portfolio companies where the founder says to me,
Let me interrupt you for a
yeah,
second, because you've come back to this a couple times now. So that essentially the key constituency, if to run your playbook,
yeah,
is that if your customer base is the key constituent, if they're so in love with your product,
yeah.
then that trumps almost anything else.
Yeah, if you have that. Now, what's interesting is there are some sectors where that works incredibly well, and there are other sectors where they might be happy to spend money on your product, but they're not interested in advocating for you
They're not in
politically,
love with you. They're not in
in
love
which
with you.
case you got to try a different approach. But yeah, because ultimately at the end of the day, everything we do at my fund, at my consulting firm, my foundation, everything else, it's just premised on that one belief that every policy output is a result of a political input. So everything we do is effectively what's going to make this person do what we want them to do, right? And what does that? It's threatening or reassuring the existence of their job and their role in office. And so if you can directly mobilize millions of people, as crypto has done really well, to tell their elected officials, like, hey, I like this thing, leave it alone, that's, more powerful than anything I've come across ever.
I assume you have AI clients these
Yeah.
days. What is your thinking in terms of how, or if, or in what degree, or at all,
Yeah.
AI should be regulated and or how it should be treated even legislatively?
So I might surprise you with this, but I believe strongly in AI regulation. I think that one of the great mistakes by government in this century was the failure to regulate Internet 2.0. So you probably know this, but in 1996, the Communications Decency Act created Section 230, which said that Internet service providers and platforms are not liable for whatever content is posted by their users. It made a lot of sense in 1996, the birth of the Internet. What no one saw coming, obviously, was social media, Facebook, all these different platforms that then took over everyone's lives. And the lack of regulation of it meant that the platforms had a perverse incentive to actually push the most toxic content on all of us all of the time because their economic model is based on clicks, and human negativity bias, which is an evolutionary trait, means that we are just hated, like it or hate it or not, more likely to click the negative thing than the positive thing. And then those companies got so big and so powerful that they almost became too big to regulate because they were so wealthy and had so much political clout. And the internet has become this cesspool that, in many ways, has destroyed society. Right? And if we don't get out ahead of AI, it's going to be that times 100. Right? And so we definitely need to regulate it. So the question is, knowing what we know now, how do you regulate it, right? It's not like we're still working off of very limited information. So, look, I think what the EU did, where they came up with frameworks of here's potential harm that be caused by AI, and here are ways we can try to mitigate that harm. That makes sense.
Okay, here's what I want
Yeah,
to ask you, and you're like
yeah,
the perfect person to ask this.
yeah,
So I'm old enough to remember that, like, even when the internet came out, there's no sales tax and things like that. I feel like the Clinton Gore era, it was like, this is a new industry. This will get us out of the early '90s recession. We are investing in the new technology to replace the factory jobs that are going away, et cetera, et
yeah.
cetera. Now, there's almost a parallel to what's going on with AI stuff now, which is, do we let this industry go unfettered? Because it could be, abundance and all this stuff, or was that this? Is that mirroring the mistakes possibly that were made in letting the early internet be so unfettered that it destroyed a lot of other industries?
So it's interesting. I think you can regulate it to try to prevent harm to individuals, to consumers, to children. I think trying to put the genie in the bottle on the economy and say, no, we're not going to let this type of growth and innovation happen, it doesn't work because it happens anyway. Or if it doesn't, your country all of a sudden becomes totally behind the times. I look at it more around the idea of every major economic transformation in history, the steam engine, the car, the computer, whatever it is, in the long term led to a lot more jobs and a lot more economic activity. And so in 20 years, when we look back at AI and say, here's 50 new industries that you and I can't even conceive of today, pretty likely yes. The problem is when you're actually the ones living through that moment, right? And there's a lot of fallout in between, and a lot of people fall through the cracks. And so, to me, the role of government here is yes, we want to protect people from the harms of AI. We also need to take care of them because there's going to be all of this job displacement. Look, I still think the universal basic income, which Andrew Yang floated as the original idea to deal with AI job displacement, is absolutely right. And I think that, I have a 19-year-old and a 16-year-old, and it's really unclear what their job prospects are going to be like because they're going to be in this moment of total transition where a lot of the jobs that are super coveted today among young people, analysts at McKinsey or Goldman or whatever it is, those jobs aren't going to exist, right? Ironically, they're coming for the white collar jobs, not what you said. The Clinton and Gore said, blue
Mm-hmm.
collar. It's actually for the white
Factory,
collar
yeah.
jobs. So the final thing would be the redistribution of the wealth around AI. It would be a tragedy if we end up with 24 trillionaires and 18% unemployment. So I do think that they're going to, and I have to come up with a taxation structure that, as some people become, wealthy beyond anyone's imagination of what they have today, and that comes at the expense of millions and millions and millions of workers, there's got to be some way to claw back that money and redistribute it to people, because otherwise you're going to have a world where lots and lots of people are suffering, and one, that doesn't lead to stability for the economy or the government or a country, and two, we're the richest, most successful country in the history of the world. Why would we tolerate a world where our own people go hungry or don't have a place to live? Like, who wants to live like that?
We should stipulate that you were an advisor to Andrew Yang's campaign.
Yep.
Universal basic income was part of the thing that he
Yep.
was talking about.
Yep.
Just two more real quick,
Yeah.
but kind of off of this last AI and regulatory thing. If there was a move or a playbook that you pioneered that you've used in the past that you might tell government or regulators to outlaw or at least constrain a little bit, do you have one?
Yeah, I have regrets, if maybe that's the question. So, for example, I invested in FanDuel. We ran a lot of the campaigns around the country to legalize daily fantasy sports betting. I have no problem with that at all. But, I still think we're better off with having it taxed and regulated than just having bookies. But there is an epidemic of young underage men betting on sports and doing other gambling. And the regulations that we have today are not nearly good enough when it comes to age verification. And so I would love to see something like biometric screening to ensure that, you're not on those apps until you are of age. And I don't have a problem with people who are of age using them. But I don't think anyone saw this coming, on the other side. So that's something that, I would really like to see fixed.
Last one, and this is sort of a pie in the sky sort of question,
Yeah.
but is there a startup idea that you wish someone would pitch you, but you feel like you've never gotten because it seems from the outside like it would be too difficult regulatorily to do?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so one is there was one that to me seemed too crazy almost and too so far removed from the ethos of tech that I thought the reason why this hasn't happened is because the world's been waiting for someone like me to come along. And the answer was the world just wasn't looking for it. But I built a social media platform for religion called Exalt. And the idea was to sort of digitize religion, let people sort of engage in it, electronically, bring people together, Bible study, whatever it might be. And it wasn't my fund. I just put tons of my own money into it, millions of dollars. And the world definitely was not interested in Exalt or a social media platform for religion. And that went belly up very, very quickly. Yeah, look, there are all kinds of societal problems that probably could be enhanced and solved with technology. But oftentimes the tech isn't built to necessarily work in government. So I'll give you a very small one. Like I worked recently on a bill at the City Council in New York to try to get rid of all the scaffolding. New York has enough scaffolding to stretch if it's linear from Manhattan to Montreal, and it leads to all kinds of quality of life problems, higher crime, things like that. And there's a very simple tool called a drone that can do 99% of building inspections without any scaffolding whatsoever. Um, Now, with that said, because government tends to be a really bad customer and people don't like businesses that rely on selling to government, there is no drone for building inspection, right? But there could be. And I think even if New York City said, hey, we would buy this product, somebody would create it. I am somewhat hopeful that even though Mondani's politics are not mine, he is young and he used tech incredibly brilliantly in the campaign so far. And I've had some conversations already about this, that he will be open to ideas to use technology to make city government operate better, serve people better, more efficiently, waste less taxpayer money. And so, there's a whole host of problems that tech could solve, but just like until we started doing it, there was no real venture fund that looked at specifically the intersection of tech and regulation. There's not really yet a sector that specifically looks to build to solve new governmental problems.
Bradley, I would point out that one way to solve the problem of if someone hasn't pitched you your dream startup is you
Yeah.
found it yourself. You could always do that.
You can. Now, I will say I have founded a few startups that I've lost a bunch of money on. So you do have to. Here's a challenge that I often have, which is whether it's creating a startup or investing in one, I see something that presents a really interesting regulatory challenge or solution, and I want to work on it because I'm excited by that. And that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with whether or not it's going to be a good business, right? And like, no matter how clever the regulatory unlock might be or what public policy problem it might solve, if there is not enough consumer demand for P to ultimately be greater than L, it doesn't really matter. And I have to remind myself of that all the time.
Last thing, you are a podcaster, so I want to let you
No, thank you.
mention your podcast and tell me recent episodes, upcoming episodes, and
Sure.
how people check it out.
Yeah, so it's a podcast called Firewall. It's politics, tech, and the pursuit of happiness, and it's really kind of that intersection of if you like the stuff that you heard in this interview, the same types of things. So, like for example, yesterday's podcast, I did a segment on the Democratic Party losing 2.1 million members. I did a segment on sort of the underlying interests of all the different stakeholders in the Ukrainian fight. I did a segment on a ticket swap app idea I had for baseball realignment. And then I did a segment, I do a lot of wellness stuff. I had something called last week TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation for OCD. And I did a segment on sort of what that was like and when people can use it. And then tomorrow's episode will be, I had Mark Bittman on today. And Mark is a very famous food writer. And he's opening up something called Community Kitchen in the East Village in New York that will kind of a new experiment in restaurants where it's a big meal and the people who have money pay full price and the people who don't pay a much more limited price, and it's an experiment of what happens if you try to do this and bring everyone together. We'll see if it works, but I wanted to give Mark a chance to promote it. And so it's a little bit of an eclectic podcast, but if you like things like tech, politics, sports, human behavior, nature, wellness, you might like it. It's called Firewall.
I was going to say, name of the show again is Firewall. Bradley, thanks for coming on this show.
Thanks for having me.